Alan here, Solid Rock Bible class. Hey, we're still working with character traits of Jesus. Today we're going to be talking about being efficient, accomplishing the greatest productivity by preparing myself and my environment. Let's look real quick over the book of Ephesians, and we'll skip over to the Old Testament for a while also. But in Ephesians 5th chapter, verse number 16, redeeming the time because the days are evil. I like the English Standard Version on this one. It says, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. It's been said that if an individual takes and increases his or her efficiency as little as 10%, often increases their income, they increase their opportunities as much as 100%. If you look at a great racehorse that's worth millions of dollars, it's worth 10 times as much as some other horse possibly, not because it runs 10 times as fast, because sometimes it's only a second or a fraction of a second different. If you've ever really thought about steam, and if you've ever thought about water boiling starts producing steam at 212 degrees. 210 degrees doesn't produce steam. 211 degrees doesn't produce steam. But what happens when you hit 212 degrees? All of a sudden, it will run locomotives, it will run engines, it'll run all types of things. It's powerful at that particular point just by an extra degree or two. So, we're going to look at Nehemiah here just for a little bit. There's some lessons I think we really can learn from the book of Nehemiah and the person of Nehemiah. I think we best know him for his leadership in taking and rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And as we kind of think about this, we're really trying to say, how can we just be that split second faster? How can we just be that little bit better? That better leader, that better person. How do we do that? Well, Nehemiah, he took, and as we look at this, we'll be kind of in the first and second chapters here, and I'm going to paraphrase a lot of it, but Nehemiah, when we take and we really look at him, starting in Nehemiah, the first chapter, and when we look at verse 11, and we'll be kind of in between chapter 1, verse 11, up through chapter 2, in verse number 4. But one of the things that we really see here is that Nehemiah is reliant on God the Creator. He is seeking God's will. He's seeking God's way here. We all know that Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer for a great Persian emperor. We see that in the first chapter of Nehemiah, verse number 11. One of the things that a cupbearer did in his position, he was somebody that was extremely trustworthy, and he took and he would take a sip of the king's wine, and he would take and check out the king's food prior to taking and having the king do it to make sure it wasn't poisoned, to make sure it was okay. So he had to be extremely well trusted by a king here to do what he was doing. If we want to kind of relate that to today's and the type of a position today, I guess we could kind of compare it to a president having an advisor or a cabinet member, before he or she would take and make a decision or some sort of a public statement, they would take and they would run it by those advisors. And that's kind of what Nehemiah was. Even though he was in captivity here at this point, he was a person that was well trusted. Now, Nehemiah, he heard the news here back with his people back in Jerusalem about the great trouble they were having and the disgrace that was happening with the wall of Jerusalem, how it was all broken down. The gates were torn down. They were burnt with fire. We see that in the first chapter, the first couple of 3 verses here. And it upset him greatly. He could have said, I've got this really good position. I may be kind of in captivity here, but I got a really good job. I've got a really good position here. It's not my problem. It's not my circus. It's not my monkey, you know? I'm just going to leave that to them. I'm going to stay living in the palace and enjoying what I'm doing. He could have said, I'm not going to do anything about this problem. My position and my power, yeah, I guess I could take and do something here. And Nehemiah could have done something on his own. He could have just stepped in and did something on his own. But we're going to notice something about Nehemiah. He had reliance on the power of God. He carefully sought after God's will in this situation. In Nehemiah, the first chapter, verse number 4, I'm going to read that real quick. And it says, and it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Notice what he had to say here. Look at the text we have here. He says, when he heard of these things, it tore him up inside. He sat down and he wept and he mourned. And he didn't do it just for a moment or two. It wasn't a fleeting moment. And it says for certain days he fasted and he prayed before the God of heaven. He was taking and seeking God's will here. Then for some days, not just for hours, he took and he mourned this and he went over this. As we look into verses 5 through 11, we can see his prayer. And in verse number 11, we can see his trust that he has in God. So let's look at Nehemiah, the first chapter, in verse number 11. It says, O God, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants, who desire and fear thy name, and prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. For I was the king's cupbearer. He said here, he says, give your servant success today by taking and granting him favor in the presence of this man. He's talking about in the presence of the king here. So before Nehemiah did anything, we see that he took and he sought God. He asked him for his favor by praying for him. He says, forgive us for thinking that prayer is a waste of time here. Prayer is not a waste of time. Peter Marshall said, forgive us for thinking that prayer is a waste of time, and help us to see that without prayer, our work is a waste of time. We need to be in God's will. There's a principle here I think we kind of need to look at. Efficiency of work, it requires complete reliance upon God. Say it one more time. Efficiency of work requires complete reliance on God. So if you want to be efficient, servant of the Lord, we must never, ever neglect the importance and the power of prayer. If we would not take and seek God first, then our work, it would be a total waste of time. The second thing I want us to look at here in regards to Nehemiah, we notice that he sought God's will here, but Nehemiah carefully took and he surveyed all of the circumstances around what was going on with Jerusalem and the wall of Jerusalem and the people there. We see this in the second chapter, verses 1 through 5, as we look at it. And, you know, the next step Nehemiah did here, that he took and he carefully took and he surveyed all of those circumstances. After knowing that God would use him to take and build the wall of Jerusalem once again, he didn't rush into the situation. He still had some planning to do. By the way, I've seen people, and we'll talk about this later, they do a lot of planning and they never do any doing, okay? So, but Nehemiah, he took and he carefully surveyed the circumstances in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 2. And we see Nehemiah's dialogue with the emperor According to some Bible commentators here, Nehemiah has sought the matter, he's thought this matter through ahead of time, and he's done it in God's presence. He's went over every scenario that he can think about, because if he's going to take this challenge, he's going to have to ask the king for the ability to step away from his position, at least for a period of time. So Nehemiah, the second chapter, let's pick it up in verse number 1. And it says, "And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of Alexandrus the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had been before time sad in his presence. Therefore the king said unto me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing that thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow in thy heart. Then I was very sore afraid. And I said unto the king, Let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad, when the city, the place of my fathers, lieth in waste, and the gates therefore are consumed with fire?" So as we look at Nehemiah's dialogue here with the king, we can kind of see everything that it went really, really smooth. Maybe it was because Nehemiah had listed down every possible response and thought it through, and he really took and he sought God's will and how to handle the king with these actions and these dialogues, and has listed everything maybe that could possibly come out of a response of the king. I know I've done that at times in thinking about things, just thinking it through and making sure that I've got it right. So Nehemiah didn't rush to Jerusalem. He did some research here before he started. And there's a principle here: efficiency of work, it requires complete research here. My point here is this: in doing the ministry of God here, we should also let our minds work. We must do some careful research, gather all the necessary information, all the details. We have to know the situation. We have to know the need. We have to have some solutions, some proposals here for us to be efficient in God's work. I know that research, in a lot of times, it takes a lot of effort on our part, doesn't it? It's just like we just kind of talk off the cuff. We don't do any research on things because it's difficult. It'd mean our time is taken up, and sometimes we just don't like to sacrifice our time. But God's given us a mind here, and he's given us a mind to use with efficiency for his glory. So let us use it, I guess you could say, for the glory and the honor of God. If we can do some research at work, and if we can do research at school, why can't we do research when it comes down to serving God? So to run, a split second faster, like we was talking about with that racehorse, we've got to do some research here so that we're sharp and we know what we're doing. Then I want us to notice here in the second chapter, verses 6 through 9, we notice here Nehemiah, he carefully took and he shaped the course that he was going to go in. He took and he really shaped the course here. As a result, Nehemiah took and he did all this research. He was able to shape the course the way it needed to be shaped. So after lying down all the cards, he knew that at the end, God would take and give him the king's approval. I think he knew he had the king's approval when he approached him. So, we can see that favor was upon Nehemiah because it pleased the king to send him. In verse number 6, notice the king's response here. And the king said unto him, and it says, the king said unto him, and then notice right here it says, the queen also sitting by him, For how long shall thy journey be? And when wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. So Nehemiah had everything organized. It's important. He had everything organized. Before he ever asked for the king's approval, he had a plan. He had a course of action here. He had it all shaped because he'd done all the research. One author actually that I checked into said that he was so organized in his mind, he had everything in an order, and when asked by the emperor of what his needs were, he already knew what to ask for. So I picked up on an illustration, and it's kind of a funny one, especially it seems like in this COVID world, it's kind of a funny one. But a man took and hurt his finger when he was downtown. And he asked someone, "Hey, where do I go for help?" So he went to a building, and there were two doors marked, physical and mental. So of course, he hurt his finger, so he went into the physical door. Inside there was two more doors. One was marked bone, one was marked muscle, and he went to the one that said it was the bone because he kind of thought he had a broken hand here. And inside that, there's two more doors. One says surgery, one says therapy. So he went into the surgery door, and inside there were two more doors, major and minor. And he went and he went inside the one that said minor, and all of a sudden he finds himself out on the street, back out where he started. So, somebody asked him about, "Hey, how did it go at the doctor's office?" And he said, "They were very efficient, but I didn't get anything done." So the principle here, kind of efficiency requires some regulation here. And so by regulation, I mean to take and to bring things into order, a method of uniformity here. It's a rule here dealing with procedures. And I hate procedures. I have to live by procedures at work day in and day out, but procedures are necessary. It's necessary in our every single day work, our school life, whatever we're doing. Regulation in work means putting things in order, getting the details down, the procedures down. We need to put everything in order. Especially, I think we need to do that in God's work. So many times I think we have slapped things together and done it so terribly and so bad of order. And I know I've seen a lot of that, and when I've been out and about. But God's work, it needs to be done decently. It needs to be done in order. So in order for us to put things in order, we've got to regulate some things. We have to shape some things. We have to shape the course of things. Every time we're doing something for God, it's a lot easier to take and be more efficient in the Lord's work. And he's planning, and in the organization, we need to take and be responsible Christians. We don't need to be wasting time. We don't need to be wasting money. We need to be responsible Christians. When we're involved in ministry, let's spend time with the Lord and doing the research and the regulation, marking out the course of where we're going. To run a split second faster, like we talked about a moment ago with a racehorse, we got to regulate some of God's work here. And then I've got one last little piece here I want to catch in regards to Nehemiah. As we look at Nehemiah, he carefully took and he staged the course. After all seeking God's will here, he looked and surveyed out all the circumstances. He took and he shaped the course. Nehemiah staged the course. He put it into reality. He put it into reality. Along with the process Nehemiah took, he faced opposition on this project. It didn't go smooth. In the second chapter in verse 10, there were people that were opposing him. They didn't want this to happen. They had their reasons. They didn't want this wall to be there. They did not want Jerusalem to be a fortified city. And even when Nehemiah was rebuilding the wall, he still faced all of these opportunities and these problems. But Nehemiah, he was determined to take and stay the course. So Nehemiah, he took and he staged his course. In Nehemiah, the 6th chapter, we go down a few chapters here in verse number 15. I want us to read this, and it says, "So the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month, in 52 days." That's incredible if you think about it. An entire wall around a city with gates, it was put together in 52 days. There was people calling Nehemiah off the wall, saying, "Come down here, let's talk about this." He says, "I don't have time to talk. It's now time to work. I've already done all the planning. I've done all the staging. I've done all the regulating. Now it's time to work." So the walls of Jerusalem, they were built back because Nehemiah took and he trusted God. He did some planning. He acted on the plans. He acted on the plans. Someone said, even if you're on the right track, you're going to get ran over if you're just sitting there. So the principle here is efficiency of work. It requires putting things into reality, doing something. Not just sitting, not just talking about it, not just planning it, but doing it. And as we take and we put things into reality, expect there's going to be opposition. There's also going to be some opportunities that's going to come up, but we're going to have some opposition. Remember, we're doing this for God himself. We're not doing this for anybody else. It's the Lord's work, and Satan is the enemy, and we are going to have problems. And he's going to try everything in the world to get us sidetracked. Or he's going to do everything in the world to get us just to sit on the track, just to sit on our hands, just to not get called to action. But we have to remember, the gates of hell will not prevail against God's work. So back to that thought of that racehorse, just a split second faster. Let's put our plans into reality. It's more than probable that an average man with no injury to his health can increase his efficiency by 50%. And this means that we could run just a split second faster. Just think about that for a second. It's possible for us, it's possible for the average man, without any kind of injury to their health, to increase efficiency by 50% without ever hurting themselves. And then we would be running that much faster, wouldn't we? Back to the English Standard Version of Ephesians 5th chapter, verse 16. Making the best use of time because the days are evil. One of the character traits we need in our lives is to be efficient in God's work. Hey guys, I will catch you in the next segment. Been great being with you today.